for years and years and years, the idea was the dollar was going to lose value and go through hyperinflation, and then that's how it would lose. Well, then over the last couple of years, the dollar, despite all the QE, despite all the helicopter money, it actually made it to a 30-year high last year. The reason that China was in a tough spot last year, the reason that Japan was in a tough spot, the reason that Europe was in a tough spot, the reason that many countries around the world were in crisis last year was because the US dollar was getting stronger. And the reason the US dollar was getting stronger was the rate hikes. Now, as the rate hikes expectations have backed off, that has allowed the dollar to come back, and that's taken the pressure off of the global economy. But what else started happening about 6 months ago, about the same time that the rate hike expectations started coming down, is we started to bump up against the debt ceiling. Okay. Now, what happens when the debt ceiling is raised? Which, listen, number one, it absolutely will be raised. It's just a matter of when. When that debt ceiling is raised, the Fed is going to be in there selling bonds like crazy, and they're going to be draining a lot of that liquidity. And if you look historically, whenever we have bumped up against the debt ceiling, it has historically been a weak time period for the dollar. And as soon as that debt ceiling has been raised, the dollar typically tends to appreciate. Now, there's always exceptions. It's not always the case, but I'm just telling historically that is what has happened. If they don't transact in dollars and they start de-dollarizing, then there's going to be less dollars circulating in the world. And if there's less dollars circulating in the world, it's going to be harder to service those US dollar liabilities outside the United States. And that typically would lead to a contraction, not a boom. Well, the Belt and Road, you're right, though. A lot of those bonds are coming, or those loans are coming under pressure. If you think about the Belt and Road, it's really a copycat of what the U.S. did with debt diplomacy around the world for much of the last 50 or 60 years. In many cases, China doesn't necessarily mind if they default, because then they get to go in and extract natural resources or take over an airport or a railway or whatever it is. So in many ways, that's kind of part of the strategy. A lot of these Belt and Road initiatives have been done in dollars. The China has used their dollar surpluses to extend credit in dollars. I think as this dollar shortage, I think that will happen, comes up in the years ahead. I think these will increasingly come under pressure. I think we've reached this point in the cycle, this grand cycle where this debt super cycle, where debt is going to matter. The problem with trying a Chinese yuan milkshake is nobody wants yuan. It doesn't even trade outside of China very much. There's an internal yuan and an external yuan, and so if there's no demand outside of China for yuan, it's really hard to see a yuan milkshake. Domestic currency demand outside the United States is really what sets the dollar apart. It's important to understand that empires always fall at some point. But it's also important to understand that, inevitable is not the same thing as imminent, and going in on a low probability event is not the same thing as going in on a high probability event.
The Fed is very clear. They're like, I'm really concerned about inflation. Inflation is too high. I think that every Fed speaker basically said the exact same words. Inflation is too high. And they're signaling this very strongly, that inflation is too high and they want to go higher for longer. So they want to keep interest rates higher. But this whole rate hike cycle, the market has been fighting the Fed. They've been saying, first they said that the Fed would never be able to hike interest rates to about 5%, which is where we are today. And then they said, after hiking very aggressively later in the year. And this whole rate hike cycle, the market has been very, very wrong. We've seen this happen over and over again. Right after the great financial crises, the Fed was telling the market, we're going to stay lower for longer. We're going to keep interest rates around zero for a very, very long time. But the market thought the Fed was always thinking that, around the corner, the Fed is going to hike rates. Why? Because that's how the world worked for the decades before the great financial crises. The market now thinks that the Fed is uber dovish and they're always going to cut interest rates at the turn because that's what they do. So as the market prices in 2 or 3 rate cuts later in the year, I'm thinking that there will be none, and that the Fed will continue again to emphasize that they're going to stay higher for longer. And so when they're looking at inflation being super high, they're thinking, The way that I get inflation down is if I raise unemployment a little bit. Since the 1980s, people have smaller families, so the working population is shrinking. So you're going into a world where the supply of labor is decreasing, and that's going to cause strong labor demand. So that's making the Fed's job of raising unemployment more difficult. The Fed raised rates, and one of the things that happens with higher rates is a stronger dollar. It is an explicit mechanism of monetary policy. So according to traditional economist thinking, you raise interest rates, dollar strengthens, and because the dollar strengthens, you have less inflation. It's one of the channels that the Fed operates through. And Chair Powell was very clear about this at his congressional testimonies. Yeah, you hear a lot of people talking about, I don't like the dollar, why we're using dollar, especially in Brazil. Now, when you hear people say that, there's truth to that, but we also have to note that these are politicians and maybe they're playing to their domestic voters. I think one way that's helpful to think about why the dollar persists to be so popular is to understand the impact of network effects. It's kind of like a credit card system in the sense that if you have a credit card, you want it to be a MasterCard or a Visa because MasterCard and Visa are accepted worldwide. Amex and other networks are also very good networks, but they're just not accepted as widely as the US dollar. And so because of that, these network effects, it's really, really difficult for people to move away from the dollar. Yeah, so whether or not to have a central bank digital currency is a political decision. When you listen to Fed speakers talk about central bank digital currency, you'll have people like former Governor Randall Quarles who will say that I have no idea, basically say like, I have no idea why we need this, everything works well. And you'll have people like Lil Brainerd, who is also a member of the World Economic Council and very close with the Biden World Economic Forum and very close with the Biden administration, be very pro CBDCs. And then you have people like Chair Powell who are very much more moderate, and he will say something like, we can think about this, but we don't want to do this unless we have an explicit mandate from Congress. So he's punting this decision to the elected leaders, which I think makes a lot of sense. The organization, the Fed, and I'm sure other central banks are not necessarily uniformly behind it. It's a political decision, and our leaders in the Fed have different viewpoints. And the current leadership, as I perceive it to be, is trying to slow walk this a little bit. And I think they probably understand what the ramifications of a Cbdc would be. So until we have a new Fed chair, I don't think it's going to happen.